You're on CYInterview.
I'm Chris Shandek. Featured columnist Jay Bilstein is with me today on CYInterview. We have a real treat. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Miami Dolphins becoming the first and still only NFL team to have an undefeated season ending with a Super Bowl victory. NFL Hall of Famer, Miami Dolphins fullback from that team, Larry Csonka, joins us now. His new book is titled Head On, a memoir. Larry, thanks so much for being with us on CYInterview. How are you today, sir?
I'm up, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and ready to go. Chris and Jay, how are you doing?
We're doing pretty good, Jay.
We are doing quite well indeed.
So, Larry, with your new book, Head On, a Memoir, I'm sure there were a lot of memories. Did you come up with any new thoughts about what made the 1972 undefeated Miami Dolphins such a great team?
Over the years, there's been a lot of opinions cast on that. I don't think there was any revelation that I came up with. I think I had a moment that caused me to start really considering writing a memoir when Coach Shula passed. I just, that was kind of a wake-up call for the fact that I'm getting older. If we're going to write a memoir, we need to do it. So that's kind of what Audrey said to me, and I followed suit. And I think that moment in time was a realization that the past is here.
However, Larry, especially for those of us who were alive back then, this is not your first book. And, of course, back in '73, you wrote a book with the other half of what was known as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, after the famous movie with Paul Newman and Robert Redford in 1969 called Always on the Run, of course, with the now late, great Jim Kick. As we got on this morning, I said, I wonder how different this interview will be than if we were speaking to you back 50 years ago. But 50 years ago, who knows what kind of mayhem you might have been in the night before, no?
That was part of our lifestyle back then, but not as big a part as what football was. I think that was in a transition time when we had gone from being the worst team in the league to pursuing being the best team ever. And luckily, Dave Anderson, the guy that was the author of that book, that wrote that book in conjunction with Jim and I, picked that year of '72 to go game by game and do a book about the two of us, and it just worked out beautifully.
And it was a phenomenal book, and now you have another phenomenal book, Chris.
Larry, what do you think Coach Shula would think of your new book?
I think he'd like it. I think I stayed as much with reality as I saw it as I possibly could, and he was that kind of coach. He liked to deal with what we know, what are the facts. And, he was the kind of coach when you played for him, if he knew you were into it and sincere as he was, and that's quite a mouthful to say, as sincere as he was. I don't know if any of us ever got to be that sincere, but if he doubted you for a moment, if he thought you were the kind of guy that would go through practice, learn something about the other team, decide that's enough you needed to know, go through the motions through the week, and then start to go through the motions in the game, he would trade you in a minute. He did not like anyone that went through the motions. In other words, you had to be as intense and as sincere about the victory as he was. And there wasn't many of us that could step up to that and stay at that podium for as long as he stood at it.
When the Miami Dolphins made Super Bowl VI and lost to the Dallas Cowboys 24-3, you write on page 191 that the city of Miami was beyond thrilled that the Dolphins even made the Super Bowl. But because you lost, Coach Shula said, I don't believe in a parade for losers. Do you think a moment like that had to have been some of the motivation for what came the next season?
Oh, my goodness, yes. That was the beginning. Right after that game, right after we had our butts kicked by Dallas, I got to know a guy named Bob Lilly personally in that game and didn't like it. But he gave us tremendous motivation. Coach Shula used that. He had been through that ringer before. I think Super Bowl III at the hands of Namath. And he knew what came next. And he got us all in the locker room, threw everyone out except the coaches and us, and said to us, I want everyone in this room to remember what just happened. Do not blank this out of your mind. Do not walk away from this. We're going to use this. We're going to feed on this. And next year, we're going to treat every game as though it was a Super Bowl. And at that point, Jim Kick, who was a pretty close friend of mine, was sitting just a matter of inches from me on the bench. He looked at me and winked and said, buckle up. And I realized that as intense as he was to get us, a losing team, to the Super Bowl and then lose it, that the intensity was even going to increase at that point. And that's why Kick was winking at me and saying, buckle up, because he knew what Shula was capable. He knew he sensed how deep he was going to get. And that's what he did. He never said to us, our objective is to go one game at a time, win every game. He never said that. He never even implied that. What he said was, we're going to treat every game as though it was a Super Bowl next year until we get back to the Super Bowl and win it. Now,
you know what, Larry, let's unpack that quickly for a moment, because you brought up, of course, Don Shula when he was coach of the Baltimore Colts and the loss to the New York Jets in the Super Bowl. How formative do you think that loss was for him? If I recall, Don Shula, I think, was the youngest coach in the league and showed tremendous promise at Baltimore. And then he came up against the New York Jets, Weeb Ewbank, and, of course, Broadway Joe Willie Namath, and, Namath said, hey, we're going to win and all, and Namath was young and brash, and the Jets won. How formative, how much of the fire in the belly do you think that caused for, and great is an overused word, but we've got to apply great to you, to the Dolphins, to many of your teammates, and certainly to Coach Shula. How formative do you think that was for the great coach Don Shula in the approach he took with you guys in the championship season?
I think that was the bedrock. That gave him more determination than ever. He couldn't see it and couldn't attain it at Baltimore, had an opportunity to come to Miami. He carried that with him to Miami, took a losing team, the losingest team in the league at the time, turned it around, pursued, went back to the Super Bowl, lost it again. Now his motivation, I believe, doubled. And I hesitate to say that because it was so extreme first, but that gives you some indication of the awe that it was we were all struck by how motivated this guy could be. After losing the second Super Bowl, he was determined as death to show up and do it and get us back and win it. And he was so determined that it became an obsession. And you talk to other players on that team, I think they'll back up what I'm saying. There was no going through the motions ever on a practice field, or certainly on a game day circumstance, that you could get away with without him just coming unglued about it. So he was right there at every instant and pushing all the time. And we literally went through that season, and somehow, some way, I would not insult your intelligence to tell you that we treated every game as though it was a Super Bowl. We approached every game as though it was a Super Bowl, and it was the most meaningful game we were going to play because of his motivation and his foot in our butt. But what worked out was that somehow, some way, someone on the team, it wasn't always domination and persevering with a power running game or our defense taking the ball. It was different guys making big plays at different times. Not even starters. Sometimes it was a punter we had named Larry Csonka that saw something and turned the game around at Pittsburgh. Charlie Babb, a guy that was a backup defensive back that spotted something on the other team's punting situation, blocked a punt against Cleveland, turned the game around for us. There were different people that stepped forward in different instances in different games that made the difference in us obtaining and securing that undefeated season. So it was a total team effort. And that's what makes it such a great thing to be a part of.
Chris?
Larry, after 50 years of the Miami Dolphins still being the only NFL team in history to have won a Super Bowl, has perfection taken on a new meaning for you?
Yeah, well, that's one of the few times in my life that I feel as though I obtained a thing where I could say that I was part of something that was perfect. how many times in your life are you ever in a situation where everything is perfect? We talk about it, we aspire to it, certainly in all different facets of our life. But how often does something actually happen where you can say, well, that was absolutely perfect? I designed it that way, I thought it out, thought through it, went after it, and did it, obtained it, and now it's perfect. It's rare, and I think the NFL record substantiates that. No one else has done it.
On Sunday Night Football, on October 23rd, you went to midfield for the coin toss before the Miami Dolphins and Pittsburgh Steelers game. What did that feel like to be back on the field?
Well, it's a different place, it's a different time, it's the same team, and it was rewarding to be there. I think the thing that I look forward to the most in going back is seeing the other players that I played with. The Manny Fernandez's, Howard Kindig, the linemen, the offensive linemen, some of the offensive linemen are still walking that were in front of me during those days. To go back and sit and watch a game with them and watch what they pick out and how they notice how the game has changed. To experience that and be back with them kind of, the spirit raises up. It's just like right now. I'm starting to have calls from Manny Fernandez and different guys calling me up saying, who's Philly playing this week and what's going on? Because, you see, that's the great part of being an undefeated team, and the only undefeated team, is we're still active. We're still alive with it. We still raise up and start to talk about it. The spirits raise up out of the dust and start to circulate. And it's like we're still competing. And I know that's a stretch and it's kind of out of bounds, but at the same time, it's reality. We still feel the competing sense when someone starts going 7-0 or 8-0 like Philly is right now.
For our listeners who would like to know, how many of your teammates are still with us here from that perfect team?
I would guess that there's probably 1/3 of that team is gone, and there's probably 2/3 still walking. I don't have it down to the exact numbers, and I don't really care to get into it that much because I don't like to remember them in the sense of being gone. The great thing is when Manny Fernandez calls me and says, "What do you think about Philly?" and we start talking, it's like all those players are still here. So, they're all taking part, You wonder what one of them would say. Sometimes Manny speaks for what Jay Scott would say, or one of the other players, Nick Bonacani, that isn't here, and how they would feel about what Philly's chances are of going undefeated.
Well, the undefeated.
You know what, Larry? I want to take it back for a quick moment. Talk about, when other teams start creeping up, they're 8-0 and so forth, and you start scratching your head and say, wait a minute, where's this going? Let's go back 37 years ago, almost 37 years. I want to say December of 1985, a little team called the Chicago Bears under Mike Ditka.
Oh, yeah.
And I believe they had a critical game against Miami. It was in Miami, I think, if my memory's working this morning. How much of a threat and it was Monday Night Football, was it not?
That's exactly right. You're getting there. I was trying to add it as you were talking, but you got it all. We ended up on a Monday night game, and I think, it started out about 1/4 of the old 72 team was going to be coming to the game, and by the time the ball was kicked off, I think there was 3/4 to 4/5 of the 72 team was standing on the sidelines behind the current team. So if there was anything about putting a bad mojo on somebody, I think we managed to do it and caused Chicago to drop that game.
Was that, in your mind, the time when you thought your legacy was facing the greatest threat of somebody actually tying with you and having an undefeated season?
I think it was, because as close as what New England came, I think because Ditka so coached in a very similar fashion as Shula, and they looked and sounded a great deal like the 72 team, the Bears team of that year. And as a result of that, I think it inspired a bunch of us to show up and be on the sidelines alongside Coach Shula. And, I don't know if you can wish evil on anybody. I don't know if that voodoo stuff works. I have no idea. But I tell you what, all that 72 team that was there on the sidelines, and most of it was, you could feel the intensity. And I think if there was ever a situation where it did affect the game, perhaps that was it.
You know, it's interesting what you say, Larry. I was thinking just as you were saying it, that there was a kind of similar intensity between Don Shula and Mike Ditka for some reason, and I might be wrong, although Don Shula was, late great Coach Shula was very, very hardcore. I think there was also something that he shared in common with a coach like Marv Levy up at Buffalo, where there was also a cerebral side to Don Shula, where I'm not saying that Mike Ditka wasn't cerebral, but I think Mike Ditka weighed more on just hardcore, period, without perhaps the reflectiveness when it came to strategy that Don Shula showed. Am I right there or am I wrong?
I think you're following the right avenue. I think you might have the actual stop times a little mixed up. I'll add this to what you just said. Ditka and Shula were very similar in their intensity and their approach to the game and their sincerity about winning. Fortunately, Coach Shula had a much greater supportive staff with him. He did a fine job in assembling 6 other coaches or 7 other coaches that escorted us through the 72 season that were excellent in their approach to the game and just as sincere and intense as Shula in the sense of caring about the game, but even more prone to detail. I don't think that Ditka, if you're looking for the difference in those 2 men in that scenario, in that situation of going undefeated, I don't think that Ditka had the supporting staff in coaching that Don Shula had, and for that matter, I don't think that he had the supportive staff in the form of talented players on the field that we had in 72. But Ditka made a run at it and came very close.
Indeed he did, but Miami's legacy lived on, and that was a very historic night for the NFL, Chris.
Larry, when you end up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, what did you feel? Like, how did you break it down, your contributions to the game at that point?
Well, for me to get in the Hall of Fame, you know, I tried to get in the Hall of Fame when I was 13 years old and got thrown out twice. That's in the book, too. You might read about that.
Yeah.
I went down and tried to be part of the ceremony. I was enthralled to be in that part of Ohio and there, but a couple of ushers saw to it that I was not part of the operation that day. But then coming back, it's very great feeling to stand there in front of the audience. But when you're a power running back, I think I single out power running back because your power running back is so dependent upon the ability of his offensive lineman, and I was. You have to work in a very tight, uniform unity with them, understand how they think, how they're going to react in milliseconds in order to execute that and have a ball control offense. Other players are more singular in their. You look at a guy like Paul Warfield. Not to say he's not a team player, certainly without an offensive line to do what he has to do to protect the quarterback. He never had a quarterback deliver the ball to him. But at the same time, he's not as nearly as dependent. He's downfield predominantly on his own and has to make the play downfield by himself, catch the ball. A power running back's a little different. So when you ask me about being inducted into the Hall of Fame, when I stood there at that podium and wondering how many of my offensive linemen that were so crucial to me getting there, and then now years later to look back, Bob Kuechenberg was up 6 or 7 times and was almost voted in and never got in. I would trade my spot in the Pro Football Hall of Fame for Bob Kuechenberg to be there, because without him, none of us get to the final goal. None of us go undefeated. And that's part of the team thing that it gets singled out with the Hall of Fame. That's the only gripe I might have with the Hall of Fame is it singles out a lot of players, and they did perform greatly, but they performed greatly because the other players around them performed greatly. And I'm one of those. And I realize that. So when you asked me about it, I was delighted to be in the Hall of Fame. But at the same time, right now, if someone came to me and said, here, flip this coin and suddenly, magically, you'll be out of the Hall of Fame and Bob Kuechenberg will be in it, I would say flip it, because he deserved it.
One other thing we learned in Head On a Memoir, which I didn't really know, was that you had a show business and acting career. You were in the movie Midway. You were pals with Burt Reynolds. Can you reflect a little bit about all that?
Well, because of the public awareness of the sport, it blends that kind of thing, and I got to meet a lot of folks that I otherwise wouldn't have gotten to meet. Some of those folks afforded me an opportunity to try acting in the Hollywood scene, and I'm afraid I just wasn't cut out for that. I tried it, and it seemed all right. I just would rather be in Alaska. I quite honestly aspired to get to Alaska from the time I was about 8 years old, 7, 8 years old, and I got turned towards the NFL and went through that, but still used that as a tool, as a mechanism to get me finally to Alaska, where I could be there and spend, we spent 17 years doing an outdoor show up there and got to travel all over Alaska and saw some really outback places that are simply beautiful.
Where did that motivation come from, or that inspiration come from? Everybody in our lives sometimes has this thing where, like, I have to get to this place, or this is where I want to end up. Like, where did that come from?
My mother, when I was probably 5 or 6, maybe perhaps 7 years old, brought home an old Field and Stream, and it had a picture of a Kodiak there on the front cover. I think we put that in the book somewhere, or did a likeness of it. And I just sat down when I went out to carry the groceries in on her little farm from the car, and Mom had stuck that on top of a grocery bag. She had bought it for me because she knew I was fascinated by grizzly bears. And I just sat there while the ice cream melted and read it from cover to cover, the story that was included about Kodiak Island in that magazine. And at that point, it was just it was an absolute obsession of mine to get there. And I think a lot of us, particularly kids that grow up in the Midwest and the country and spend a lot of time outside with nature, I think we aspire to go back to the frontier. And I think the frontier is finally, the last frontier is in Alaska. And that's a place where you can truly step back in time and see it the way it was before all the cities were built.
One last thing that I forgot to mention before we move on to some other things, and I'm sure Jay will have a few more questions. Can you describe what the atmosphere was like at Super Bowl VII against the Washington Redskins?
In a word, intense. I know I've used that superlative quite a bit today in this conversation, but that's the perfect description of Shula, our head coach. 1 week, between the conference championship game and the Super Bowl used to be a 2-week period. And we would have that first Sunday off, and Coach Shula flew to the site of the Super Bowl and spent the entire morning of that Sunday, that off Sunday, I think back when the Pro Bowl was played on that Sunday back then. He spent that day sitting in that stadium by himself, plotting where the sun was and deciding what conditions the sun would cast upon the next week when of our decisions on what to do in conjunction with the time of day. So he laid out an entire schedule of where the sun was at different times. That shows you, when I talk about intensity, that shows you how intense he was. So to describe what happened in that game, to not be up for that game would have been impossible. You couldn't be within 5 foot of him without feeling the radiant enthusiasm for winning that game. And he formed, the intensity that we felt in that locker room prior to starting that game was about the most I've ever experienced in any kind of athletic contest ever.
Whether
you know what, Larry, you've taken me back to that time, and a name popped into my mind, Garo Yepremian. After rest in peace. After after everything, after all Shula's intensity and planning and looking at where the sun was and sitting in the stadium and everything he did with you guys to prepare and all the way, and you come all the way to the end of the game, and there is Garo Yepremian, and something goes wrong, and all of a sudden a kicker is trying to become a last-minute quarterback. What was that all about, and how much heat did he take after that in your perfect season?
Where to start on that? Garo Yepremian was a kicker. And as a kicker, that's the only thing he did. So he had very little football knowledge out of that. I think that was an unturned page that Shula, it was bothering him, but he never figured it would be serious enough that he had to get so intense with that. But even when we practiced, we had 2 practice fields adjacent to each other down at Biscayne College where we spent our weeks of practice. And when the rest of the team was scrimmaging or running dummy scrimmages against each other, practicing for the upcoming game, Garo would be on the other open field, just kicking field goals back and forth and kicking the ball, and that's how he would spend his practice. And every once in a while, Shula would look over at him and holler to him, "If anything goes wrong, remember, fall on the ball." You know, in other words, don't be a hero, just cover the ball was his objective. And Garo, under fire when the ball was blocked in that game, or however it bounced back into his hands, he forgot that and tried to throw a pass. Garo's left-handed, and he tried to throw a right-handed pass. But it was caught. It was caught by a defensive back for Washington, and he scored with it. And suddenly, in a 14-0 domination-type game where we were simply grinding down the clock and grinding down the yardage, we were 14-7 with a very inspired opposing team. And it came down to the final plays and the final moments. And guys like Manny Fernandez and Jake Scott made the difference in that game. Our defense rose to the occasion and stopped the Washington Redskins with an intercepted pass late in the game. Garo Yepremian, to answer your question, was a very, very important part of our team and was critical to us in many, many situations. The longest game in Kansas City, to name one, there were many others. But in that particular instance, when it was 14-0, and we had a chance to just put it out of sight at 17-0, as a matter of fact, it would have been a 17-0 game in a 17-0 season. I think that we jumped a little too soon to go for the field goal. I was of the persuasion we were down close in their territory, and I thought we should go for it on 4th down, short yardage. But I wasn't consulted on it.
Even though the game was won, Larry, was Shula visibly hopping mad with him after the game? How did that unfold?
I think Shula was so delighted not only have won his first Super Bowl, but have completed the first ever undefeated season, and it still stands 50 years later. I think in the words of, again, I think it was Jake Scott or Bill Stanfield, one of the two of them, said something in the locker room after the game that none of us really realized what we just did. We were so busy celebrating the fact that we won the Super Bowl, and that was our objective, that we weren't thinking about the fact that we had a perfect season. Not only did we win the Super Bowl, but we had a perfect season as well. And I think that as the years go on, we learn to appreciate that more and more. I certainly do.
I think every football fan, every serious football fan feels the same way, because if we look at it in the rear view mirror, and I hate to say this because I was around, I was watching that Super Bowl, and I was a Miami Dolphin fan, and I was a Larry Csonka fan, and I had my number 39 jersey as a kid and all this kind of thing, and used to wear it when I played sandlot football. It looks more unlikely that feat will ever, look, I'll never say never, but after half a century, nobody's beaten it. I don't know what the next century holds, but it is a record that will endure the test of time. Larry, I want to go back quickly for a minute because we said, you know, a good deal here focused on the Dolphins and all, but you had quite a college career. For those people who are a bit younger or maybe not as much students of the game or don't remember, you played at Syracuse. And not only did you play at Syracuse, but you broke a bunch of records of another fullback, a fellow by the name of Jim Brown. I mean, your career is on another level altogether. It's not just about the Dolphins. When you look back, how much space does that occupy today in your mind when you look back and you say, Jim Brown was looked at one point in time as the greatest, you know, the greatest fullback to ever play the game, the greatest guy in the backfield, and here I come along to Syracuse and I eclipse some of what he did. What does that mean to you to this day?
Well, you put me in a room with some great folks. I grew up as a youngster in northeastern Ohio and used to sneak into some of the Cleveland Browns games on the back of a delivery truck. So I got to watch Jim Brown run the football while he was with Cleveland, and was inspired by it. Growing up, I wanted to play football, got into it. I go through that in the book and talk about how I almost got completely devoid of the game, but thanks to a junior high principal, steered me back onto it. And then growing up in that area and seeing Jim run the ball, and then getting to meet him later on when I went to Syracuse and having an opportunity to actually meet him, shake hands, talk with him about things, was very inspiring part of my career. And I looked forward to it. I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be able to run the ball. And it was, I go into it in the book because I was not particularly that fast, and it had to be in a setup more like a Green Bay than perhaps the Browns even had, or certainly that Miami had situation. But to have met him, grow up, idolize him, and then go to Syracuse and be afforded the opportunity, and that's really the reason I went to Syracuse, was that the head coach there, Ben Schwartzwalder, who had coached Jimmy as well, Ernie Davis, to name a few, Floyd Little. He came to the house when I was a high school student and was recruiting me to go to Syracuse, and I was also interested in Ohio State, Woody Hayes. Woody told me that I owed it to the state to go to Ohio State, and having grown up a poor farm boy, I figured that's wrong because I don't feel like I owe anybody anything. So I didn't go to Ohio State. But when I met Ben Schwartzwalder at flat asking, and I was just a 17-year-old kid and senior in high school, but he came to the house and visited with myself and my father and my mother, told us about Syracuse, told us what he'd do. And I said I was very interested in going. Ben was interested in me as a defensive player and not particularly as a running back. But I told him, or I said to him, I said, Ben, if you will promise me that you'll take a look at me at fullback, not that I'll get to be the fullback for the Syracuse team or anything. I just want you to take a look when I'm a freshman. Back then, the freshman couldn't play with his varsity. So my freshman year, I asked him if he would take a look at me if I went to Syracuse, if he would take a look at me at running back and give me a fair shake at it. He thought about it for a moment, took his finger and slid his glasses up like he used to, cleared his throat, looked me in the eye and said, "You have my word," and stuck his hand out. That's why I went to Syracuse, on Ben Schwartzwalder's word that he would give me a shot at running back as a freshman. He did that. I did enough to impress him. Then the starting fullback, my sophomore year, a guy named Brown Weir, got hurt, and he put me in besides the middle linebacker. I was also playing fullback on offense. And I got to block for Floyd Little, and then Floyd got hurt. Maybe I didn't block that well. When he got hurt, they turned to me to carry the ball, and it worked out pretty good, and that's how it went. I outlined all of that in a little more detail in the book, because it's some very interesting things happen. The personalities of those people that I've talked about and alluded to in this story on the radio here, talking, I go into a little more depth in the book and talk about it. You know, Floyd Little, Ernie Davis, Jim Brown, Ben Schwartzwalder, people of character, people that keep their word. And There's interesting stories about him, and I'm glad I had a chance to write it into the memoirs and talk about it.
You had a running style that emerged, and perhaps that you can just touch on that without giving away the book, but the book has a certain title, and I know that later on, Don Shula had some effect on your running style and all. Can you touch upon that, your initial running style, the title of the book, and perhaps the influence that Don Shula had on you and how you ran?
I ran straight ahead. I wasn't fast enough to elude people or set up fakes or things. Very little of that was ever used in my career. I ran straight ahead with design. In other words, when I say design, it had to be amassed with the semblance of my offensive line. In other words, to be a really good running, power running back, you have to have a great offensive line that's capable of blocking different scenarios and different defenses. You have to communicate with them. There has to be an intensity between the 5 or 6 of you that you understand exactly what each of them is thinking. That has to develop and be part of the power running game in order to obtain and have ball control. When I say ball control, that's the ability to take the ball and walk down the field with it, no matter what defense is put in front of you, to keep getting first downs and run that clock down, score a touchdown, and then get the ball back from your defense and do it again. Because if you can do that, and you can do it systematically and repeatedly, you become a great team, i.e. the Miami Dolphins, the Green Bay Packers. There's scads of them, go all the way back to the Detroit team. Over the years, that's been proven. So if that effective situation can be achieved with you and your linemen, you have attained something that is a true weapon.
Larry, I think I've got one more for you, and then we'll see if Jay has any more before we wrap up. But let me ask you, what do you think people can take away in their own lives who want to accomplish goals, dreams, ambitions from the 1972 Miami Dolphins team?
In a word, teamwork. The ability to count on each other, to operate almost in a military fashion where you keep your end held up. In other words, to the intensity, the sincerity and the intensity to show up and do what you're supposed to do. I can't stress that enough. I think teamwork is the essence of, we talk about that on the field, but it spills over. I mean, the great thing, and I put this in the book, Miami Dolphins in 1968, when I joined them down in Miami, the world was in a turmoil. Vietnam and the protests, there was a lot of civil strife, a lot of segregation, a lot of racial tension. All of that was in Miami, and Miami was suffering because of it. When Coach Shula came down in 1970 at the peak of all of that, and started to turn the thing around, and the Orange Bowl being located in a very rough section of Miami was right in the heart of that. And for us to start winning football games and watch how that affected other people, when they see that teamwork and see that reward, they notice it and come to it. And all those factions, we started being more than just the local team. We started to be a place to gather. And right there in the heart of a very rough section, back then we didn't park in different places, and we didn't have headphones, and we didn't ride buses with security all around it. It was pretty open. And the kids from that area of Miami would come to the game. And very often us players would take a number of them in with us and turn them loose in the stadium so they could play and watch the game. We're into the security, just the way I did with the Browns.
It's so funny.
It is. But after the game, we would come out, because we didn't have our own different parking places, separate or private parking places. We would park our cars out there, and our fans knew who was with what car. And they would come and tailgate and hang out there, and we would sit out with them. And all kinds of folks, Cuban folks, black folks, white folks, Spanish. There was a whole cross-section of humanity out in the parking lots after the game, and they were so excited about having a winning team in town. And they would sit there, and that's where tailgating really started. We call that the 12th man syndrome in the Orange Bowl back then, because it was the ball was so tight in there, and it was so close to the fans were so close to the game that they actually had an influence on the game when they would start to roar so loud. And they started waving the towels and the different things, and then we started doing the tailgating thing. But it had a communal effect. Several hundred people would stay after the game and be sitting around out there having hot dogs and beans or whatever after the game, enjoying cold beers, and the players would be sitting amongst them. It was a good community situation in a time when there wasn't many good community situations. And I think it was something that was drawn on, and it caused a kind of a spirit to start growing in Miami that Miami desperately needed at that time. Not to say that it was the final thing. Certainly people got together because they were meant to do that. And we, as Dolphins, can't claim that. But we were a contributor. And I like to think because of the camaraderie that started to show up there with the crowds and all the different players, the folks that stayed after the game and came to the game and cheered for us, that it started giving Miami a person that added to Miami's personality anyway. And I think that was a very good thing, and I'm proud of that.
Jay, anything else before we wrap up?
Oh, absolutely. Larry, in your book, I don't want to give it away, you talk about how you grew up and all, your grandma and so forth, a brush with juvenile delinquency. You were a country boy. You were a country boy. Yep. And you played at a time, I want to say that when you began playing in the NFL, we didn't even have in the league strength coaches. None of this type of thing was around yet. And I want to say, and I hope I'm not presumptuous, but you played football as a guy who was country strong. Very reminiscent, I think, of Bronco Nizerski, right? I mean, just a kind of naturally strong, kind of grew up strong, maybe from chores and so forth. Do you think that something's happened in the league where we've given up? You've used some very important words here right now, and I hope our listeners really pay attention to your words. You really exhibited some great wisdom. You didn't just say teamwork. The word sincerity has come up a bunch of times. Use the word sincerity. Use the word teamwork. You use the word community. And I think, and I say, somehow it seems those things have been lost, and I'm not knocking strength coaches, and I'm not knocking the combine, and how many times you can bench press 225, or how fast you can run the 40, or what your vertical is, or any of that stuff. I'm not knocking it. But do you think that we move too much onto the science side, let's say, and we've moved a bit away from that more esoteric side and what you talked about with Coach Shula and sincerity? Do you think that perhaps we should draw back more to sincerity, teamwork, and community, again, without losing all the good motion that's been made in the side of strength coaching and, how we could build ourselves up with weights and perform better on the field? Do you think we've lost that balance, and do you think it should come back?
Well, I agree with most of what you just said. I don't think we've lost our balance. When you say we, I think you're talking about the NFL.
Talking about the league, correct? Yeah, and society as a whole. Remember, I don't. Was there a combine when you were playing ball? I mean, today people pay attention to the combine like it's a sport in and of itself. Does that take us away from the message of football?
To some degree. I think it's still a communal effort. I think if you look at the games today, the people still show up with tremendous enthusiasm. It's a much faster game. It's a much more competitive game today. It's not as easily controlled as it once was because of the rules change. Now, in some respects, when you say, well, this player or that player is the greatest of all time, well, I've got to take issue with that. Greatest of their time certainly is more applicable in my world because there's different times that you've alluded to the fact that you can almost break it down in 10 or 15-year periods because of the rules changes as pro football matured and advanced in our society, as our society has matured and advanced. We're much more capable of immediate communication. We're much more capable of immediate truth being spread wildly. We're also capable of immediate untruths being spread rapidly. So it's nice to go to a football stadium and see someone throw a football, someone catch it. You understand that immediately. But as a fan, if you see the operation of a team where it's really unified itself to the point where, and educated itself and schooled itself to the point where it can control the ball by the running game complementing the passing game, certainly because of rules changes, it has to be that way now. Not so much back when I played. But it has to be that way now. But it's still, look at why Philly is doing what they're doing, and look at how excited the city is. My goodness, what a great time to be a Philly fan, or a fan of sports, and live in Philly. What a great thing they've got going on. But the reason that football team is going down is they can control that ball. They can take it and pound it down the field a little bit. Not like we did back in my era. The rules have changed. It's a different world, I understand. But they can still do that, and that's why they're looking at 8-0. Now, is the game as good for people as it was back then, as good as for society as we've talked about here today? I think it is, because it causes people to come together and root for a common thing and overlook their small differences. And in this country, that's a major part of being an American, is to look overlook the differences, and let's talk about what we have in common. We're all Americans. We all enjoy a football game. We all enjoy a baseball game, and that's a good thing. We enjoy being Americans because of it. And I'm a big believer in sports, and I think it's a good thing to compete with each other. But we compete with the idea that we're all one unit, and we're going to be stronger in the long run.
I think that's very powerful what you said, and it spoke to when I said we, because to me the we is not just the league, but it's the fans. And today there's much more organized fan involvement, for example, fantasy sports, of course. So there's very much the we of the compact between fans and between the game itself, because let's face facts, without the fans, there's no money, and without money, there's no game. Maybe I think back wistfully to a simpler time. I think that all of us might have that tendency who've moved on in years somewhat, but I think you've put a cap on this in an absolutely magnificent way. And I have to say this, in gaining so much in terms of entertainment and inspiration from watching you particularly, not just being a Dolphins fan, but watching you and your style of running as a kid, and finding that very, very inspiring, and the workman-like ethos that you brought to the game. I have to say, in listening to you now, you also are a man of great wisdom, and we certainly wish you many more years, hopefully being out there. Who knows, maybe there'll be yet another book or more things for you to discover, but you've made a great contribution, not just to the sport, but in listening to you today. I think you have a very powerful message for unity in a time of polarization in the United States, and I certainly thank you for that.
Chris, Jay, it's been my pleasure. I look forward to it, to answer your question about the other book. We're toying with the idea of doing one about and what it was like up there for 16 years, touring around and doing the pictures. I think I may have to go back up there and revisit some of those places just to make sure they're fresh in my mind when I talk about them. But it's a whole other thing. It's like stepping through a doorway into an earth from 200 or 300 years ago or something. It was a great experience, and I'd love to share that with the folks. I hope I live long enough to get it done.
Well, in the meantime, Head On, a Memoir is now out. Everyone can find it on Amazon, and I'm sure in many different major bookstores. Larry, final question for you. Football fans, the contributions you made in Alaska, the way that you've touched people throughout your life, what do you hope people take away from everything that you've done on this earth?
Oh, that the United States is a land of opportunity. I mean, it's what being a human and being on the planet should be about. Having the freedom to choose what you really like, and then work at it and achieve some degree of goal, some degree of success without having a boot on your chin or on your throat. And that's what we have. And places. There's a few other places in the world like that. Not a whole lot, but there's a lot of places where you don't have that kind of freedom, and we need to expand that. And I think sports are a great way to capture people's enthusiasm. Just the way the game's going on over in London now, I think that's great that other folks in Europe are getting a chance to see what American football is all about. Perhaps we'll have baseball all over the place as well. You know, who knows? But I think sports are a great way to have a commonality, and people start to recognize each other as co-fans and as humans, one man to another man, and you know, on equal terms. And that's a good thing. And I think sports promotes that, and I'm very glad to have been a part of it.
Oh, no denying that. So for Pro Football Hall of Famer, Miami Dolphins fullback Larry Csonka, featured columnist Jay Bilstein, and CYInterview, I'm Christian Nick.